إني ألقى الإناس في صومي وصلاتي ودعائي للرحمن وجميع الطاعات.
You don't even have to go to that. Yeah. All right, let's go to the next one.
No, you can. Slavery. I mean, this is the horror of Abrahamic religion generally. I mean, this is why we know these books were not authored by a moral genius. The Bible and the Quran can't give you a basis to resist slavery.
Take it away.
So this is really interesting because Sam Harris has actually written a book called The Moral Landscape. And in that book called The Moral Landscape, he writes in a footnote, in one of the ending chapters, I forget which chapter exactly, but he writes, and this is a kind of paraphrase of what he says. He says that there is no neurobiological way of ascertaining truth and falsehood. In other words, objective morality, according to Sam Harris, cannot be ascertained on the atheistic, materialistic worldview. This is not just Sam Harris's opinion. This is the opinion of Richard Dawkins, of Jacques Derrida, of Bertrand Russell, of Nietzsche, of most postmodernist atheist philosophers, that actually objective morality cannot be ascertained. What's really interesting is that on the one hand, where they make this patently clear, that there is no philosophical epistemological base for basically believing in objective morality, they'll make arguments which are moral against religion. And this is one of the arguments that they made. So he says that slavery and whatnot. Let's take for granted, let's say for the sake of argument, that he's right about slavery generally speaking. Even if he was completely right, that would do absolutely nothing for the case of atheism and absolutely nothing for disproving Islam. However, he is wrong on that because of one very simple verse in the Quran, which most of the children, our children, have memorized, in Surah Al-Balad, in chapter 90 of the Quran, where it simply says, وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا الْعَقَبَةِ فَكُّ رَقَبَةِ. What do you know of the good way? What would make you know what the good way is? Freeing slaves is the good way. His exact terminology was that there is nothing within or inside or outside of the scriptures which allows for the resisting of slavery. The Quran says very clearly that actually, وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا الْعَقَبَةِ, what would make you know what the good way is? Freeing slaves is the good way. What he is saying, because he is, I believe, theologically illiterate. I don't think he's actually someone who reads books, theological books, Quran, Sunnah, Hadith, and these things. I don't think he actually even looks at the Bible too deeply. I think he makes sociological cases and generalizes them on the religion. And that's very, very much the nature of what he does. He never quotes the Quran. You'll never really see this guy quoting the Quran.
Sam Harris
doesn't really quote the Quran. I've never seen him. I've never once seen him quoting the Quran because he knows it's muddy water for him. He's not trained on this. He shouldn't talk about this. He is what they call an ultra-crepidarian. He's non-specialist talking about something which does not concern him. He's completely talking about something which is out of his lane. When he does the same thing with philosophy, it's the same thing. He's a non-specialist in philosophy, non-specialist in theology, but he talks about both those matters as if he is an authority on those two matters. So here, he said that the Quran, and I'm not talking about the Bible now, but we're talking about the Quran specifically, there's nothing in it that would allow us to resist slavery. So he would not be able to, he would not be able to explain away that verse, which is a non-abrogated verse of the Quran. Moreover, I guess what he's trying to say is, because there are verses of the Quran which talk about what your right hand possesses and these things, and the ahadith, the various ahadith in the seerah, which shows us that there were slaves at the time of the Prophet, and we're not denying that that's the case. Absolutely, there was slaves at the time of the Prophet. We are saying that the objective of Islam,
the whole world at that time,
absolutely. Slavery ended in America in 1865. In Britain in 1807, and that's legally. Once again, if we take a step back and say, what is slavery? The international, I think it's called the International Anti-Slavery Organizations. They actually said that slavery is defined as, it includes child labor, human trafficking, and prostitution. They've said these things. If we consider these factors, and we're very serious about those definitions, then I would claim that the West is actually more involved and engaged with slavery than any other part of the world.
And I think that now, if you really care, if you really want to make a difference, since we live here, that's something that's not talked about. That's like our little secret, America's secret.
Absolutely,
here, that there are child sex slave rings in our country right now.
Up to 300,000 boys and girls are sold in the United States every year, and many of them don't make it out of the industry alive. There are only 99 known survivors from the state of Texas in the last 20 years who've managed to escape sexual slavery.
When we think of the most horrific of crimes, the ones so morally repugnant and barbaric, the widespread ones that make you question humanity, it can help us cope to believe they happen somewhere else, somewhere far away. That's why this weekend's FBI prostitution sting and capture of over 150 pimps was so disturbing. Over 100 children rescued. Sexual slavery here at home. How does it still happen?
Right.
So now you want to go ahead and do some social good.
Yeah.
Joe Rogan should step up. Sam Harris should step up.
Talk about human trafficking.
And talk about human trafficking that's happening right here in our backyard.
Yeah.
But no, you got to go talk about, this,
These
that,
things,
the
yeah.
other. Point
Absolutely.
the finger that way so
Yeah.
we don't have to really talk about what's going on at home.
It's really interesting because Polaris said that. Polaris is I think it's called Polaris, one of the organizations. They said that America's engaged in slavery. The majority of people that they enslave in human trafficking forms are actually people of ethnic minority descent, so black people, etc. Those people that are engaged in the process of human trafficking, who are trafficked, are actually people of ethnic minorities. So they are actually oppressing minorities, enslaving people, going back to what they used to be the 1865 days, and talking to us about slavery. Islam is, I would put this very candidly on the record, one of the objectives of Islam is to do away with the institution of slavery. The mechanism by which and through which it attempted to do this, which is what I was saying before, was an incremental gradualist method. It wasn't an instant abolition. And we know from history that, frankly, when abolitions are attempted, just like in this country when the abolition was attempted of alcohol, people rebel against it very quickly. If something as deep and as economically important as the institution of slavery is interwoven into the economic fiber of a society, it's not possible for you to pull the rug under someone's foot. So in other words, what Islam came with was an incremental method using different things, and of them is zakat. Because in Surah At-Tawbah, chapter 9 of the Quran, there are 9 things, or 8 or 9 things that are mentioned in the verse which talks about zakat, and one of them was wafir riqab, the people who are enslaved. So in other words, since zakat is one of the 5 pillars of Islam, and since the 5 pillar, this particular pillar must be continual until the day of judgment, we believe, then there must have been a certain amount of money always designated for the freeing of slaves. But of course, Sam Harris doesn't know this. Another thing which is really interesting is chapter 24, verse 33 of the Quran, which explicitly says that if at that particular time, it's obviously not applicable to us, at that particular historical time period, something called mukataba can be done. Mukataba is where you literally have someone who's enslaved, and then they say to their slave owner, I want to be free, and I will ransom myself. Okay? That person is not a criminal. That person is not someone who's done anything. According to chapter 24, verse 33, and you can look at, for example, Tafsir al-Qurtubi, or other tafsir, like exegesis, that explicitly say that there's an opinion that says, and this is a strong opinion, going back to the Sahaba and the companions of the Prophet, if this particular indentured servant, because they're not really slaves in the colloquial sense, because you think of slaves like racial slavery. We've never had that in Islam. That's never been part of Islamic.
Never
ever. Racial stuff. It's the Quran is very.
That's what people think. That's what they have in their head.
That we're talking about indentured, because at the time there was no prisons, so these people were put into homes and imprisoned as if it was a prison, right? So that particular person, if they demand from the slave owner to be freed, then according to Tafsir al-Qurtubi and according to the Sahaba that are related by this tafsir, they must be freed, even if the slave owner, or you can say the one who's the prisoner, the one who's imprisoning this indentured servant, declines it. This person can go to a qadi, can go to a judge, and forcefully be liberated or emancipated. So in other words, Islam, I would argue, is the only ancient system which allowed for the freeing of people which were either slaves, indentured servants, or otherwise. There's nothing else in the history of man that went out of its way in order to get people out of the shackles of slavery and into and emancipated, generally speaking, whether it be Muslim or not Muslim.
What comes to my mind, is it Zayd bin Haritha? Was it, am I saying the right name, where when he was freed and then he had a chance to go back to his father, to his family, he chose
The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
to stay, you know, out of the love, you know, out of the love that he had for Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him.
Yeah.
So you have when you take yourself living in today's 2018, today's age, right? And then you take yourself back 1,400 years ago, when the whole world, everybody,
Is immersed in slavery. Absolutely
is immersed in
everyone. Yeah.
But then Islam came to free the necks of the slaves, right?
Absolutely.
So if Islam just came and said slavery is eradicated,
It wouldn't work.
It wouldn't work. You got people
wouldn't work.
invested with millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, you know, in slave business.
Absolutely.
But then what you're saying here is now, if I'm correct, now in every which way you turn, it just made the road that now it penetrated the hearts.
Yeah.
So people gave this up
Absolutely.
from the love of their hearts.
Absolutely.
Not like it was forced in this country. And to this day, people are like, these people should be slaves, right?
SubhanAllah.
And you have all this racism. Is this correct?
Yeah, but there are certain situations where people will be forced to free slaves. For example, in Islam, if someone had sexual intercourse with their wife in Ramadan, they have to free a slave. If someone does dhihar, which is mentioned in chapter 58 of the Quran, which they call their wives, that they say that you're basically not, you're like my mother. In other words, you're not sexually compatible with me or something. It's a very specific kind of insult.
Free.
They have to free
Free, go.
slaves. Yeah, if they did if they did an oath,
Yeah.
they have to free. So there's so many things in Islam which you're forced to free slaves if you do certain things.
Then these slaves
Right.
become governors, then they become scholars, then
Yeah.
they become like, you
Absolutely.
know, people of high prestige.
People will not understand this, but some people, and because we just said that, for example, if someone was enslaved or an indentured servant, because
Indentured servant,
they
that's
were
really what it,
yeah, that's what they were. They were indentured servants. If they were in the house of someone who was imprisoning them and they had the rights over them, let's say, and they decided that they wanted to do mukataba, which is this, basically it's a ransom. They're ransoming themselves. They want to be freed. And they had that opportunity and they didn't take it. The question is, why would those people not take it? A lot of the particular slaves at that time were indentured servants. They didn't take the opportunity because they were getting free accommodation.
Yes.
And that's why a lot of them continue to be Mamalik. Like the Mamluk Empire was actually, the Mamluks, there was two Mamluks, one in Egypt and one in India. But the ones in Egypt and in India, both of those were of a slave tribe or a slave socioeconomic grouping. So they were socioeconomically the lowest of the low, yet they were made into the highest of the high. So it's not the same as the Western experience. A lot of people think they generalize history. Say, okay, what would happen in this transatlantic slave trade, where you had black people shift over from West Africa?
Yeah.
That's the same thing as what happened with Islam. It's not.
Okay, before we go to the next one, people are automatically going to see what's going on with this insane state, right?
Yes.
They use these
Yes.
fringe elements, and then some things in Libya.
Yeah.
What do you say to that?
I say to that, I mean, it's really, really interesting. The IS, Islamic State, we shouldn't call it that. We should call it Daesh or something, whatever they want to call themselves.
How about
But
the insane state?
that sounds good, yeah.
Insane.
Those particular individuals, first and foremost, I've never seen such an extreme fringe in my whole life, to the extent whereby I watched an interview in Arabic with one of the, I'm not going to mention their names, but let's say they're of the same ilk as Osama bin Laden, right? They're of the same ilk, meaning they have the same kind of, they believe in the same things. And one of their leaders said, we don't consider, this is exactly what he said, he said, we call this group back to Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. So they don't consider them Sunni Muslims. Some scholars don't consider this particular faction, it's called Khawarij, Muslims. Some scholars have said that at all. So that's one thing. Those people who have said that, they're enslaving, and this is what this person said in the interview, they're enslaving their women. So in other words, that particular, it's another faction in the Syrian war, which is, let's say, associated with extremism. That other faction was associated, he's saying, the person who's in charge of that faction, that they're enslaving our woman. What does that show? It shows, actually, to be frank, that no one sees these people as doing something in line with Islam, not even Osama bin Laden himself. And I'm saying this on the record, not even him. And we know that what he stands for and all that kind of stuff is completely against mainstream Orthodox Islam, according to all of the institutions of Islam. But not even he would see what they're doing is in line with Islam. Absolutely not.
Yeah.
I could mention names and all these kind of things, but we won't go into that. We won't go into that discussion. But the point is, this is such a fringe element of Islam that it's really not worth mentioning as a point of reference. Yet Sam Harris consistently mentions it as some kind of point of reference. It's academically disingenuous because, frankly, there are institutions in Islam, in the Islamic world. All of the institutions, one thing that has united all of the Muslims against them is ISIS. There's nothing that has united all the Muslims against them more than ISIS has.
But they still keep bringing up this fringe element.
Every Muslim
dirty
institution,
tricks. These are dirty tricks.
Every Muslim organization, from India to Saudi Arabia to Egypt to all of these, Mauritania, all of the centers of intellectual power in the Islamic world, which he's not even familiar with. I'm sure Sam Harris is not familiar with those places and those institutions. All of them have categorically condemned ISIS. All of them. So there is a consensus on this issue.
Yeah.
And yet he's using it as an example. So you're actually disregarding all of the institutional, what you would call fatwas, religious rulings and verdicts of everybody in the Muslim world. All of any scholar worth his, any scholar in the Muslim world has said the same thing.
Yeah.
So how can we ignore all of that and say, okay, well, this band of people. And Libya, the same thing, because obviously Libya and thing have the same ideology. Libya, there's ISIS in Libya. So we're killing two birds with one stone with this, because frankly, the ISIS ideology is so far removed from mainstream Islam that absolutely everybody has condemned them.
Yeah.
I don't see how that has flown above his head.
They kill more Muslims.
Absolutely, yeah.
They actually have done more harm than to Muslims.
Yes.
Before we go to the next point, I mean, there was an FBI released some data talking about that the book that most of them were found carrying with them was showing how ignorant of Islam this group, the Insane State, is of Islam. Yeah. A dummy's guide for understanding Islam.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So this is really bizarre when you hear these things. For people who are just tuning in and they're wondering, we got our Redzovic Jiu-Jitsu. We're reaching out to our brother Joe Rogan, hopefully, so he can invite some scholars onto his show and give the Muslim perspective, have a fair and balanced approach to these very important topics, because once again, these things help fuel the division. They help feed into the hate, the misunderstanding, and that leads to the violence. We've seen a lot of it. We can discuss that more towards the end. Hopefully, God Almighty Allah and can get this to him. And you, people, like you said, they can share this. They can go ahead and
comment on his videos, on his podcast, on his Instagram. That's a good way of he will know. Mention the Deen Show. Mention Mohammed Hijab. Mention Eddie from the Deen Show. Mention those things in the comments. And if there's enough of those comments, he'll see them. And if he sees them, and if you even put the link of this video on the comment, that would be even better.
Beautiful. Yeah, and he can look you up, Mohammed Hijab, and he can see some of your work and everything
Inshallah.
there. Beautiful. Thank you, my brother. Thank you, Jazakallah khair. And thank you guys for tuning in. Take that advice, share it. If you care, share, and tune in here every week to the Deen Show. We'll see you next time. Until then, peace be with you. Assalamu alaikum.